Hi everyone, welcome to Ms. Sawagid's math class. Remember last time we talked about classifying real numbers to rational numbers or irrational numbers. And the main key was that rational numbers can be written as a fraction, but irrational numbers, you can't write them as a fraction. Let's see why. For you to understand that, let's start with something simple. For example, 0.3, how do you write that decimal number into fraction? The first method is to read it and then write it as a fraction. 3/10, which means 3/10. That's the fraction of this decimal form. Here's another way. 0.3, I need to think about getting an integer. For me to get an integer, you move the decimal to the right. But how many times do you move the decimal to the right? Only once, because you only have one digit after the decimal. So multiply 0.3 by multiples of tens, depending on how many times do you need to move that decimal. Since I'm moving the decimal one time, you multiply by 10. But that changes the value of 0.3. So I have to divide by 10. Now you have a number times a fraction. Make that number a fraction by putting it over 1 and multiply across. 0.3 times 10 is 3, and 1 times 10 is 10. To simplify that, you got 3/10, which is the same thing as the first one. So think about how many times do I need to move the decimal to get an integer by multiplying it with multiples of tens. Now let's practice one more example, and I promise it will get easier. Here's an example, negative 0.148. How do you write that as a fraction? Ask yourself first, how many times do I need to move the decimal to the right to get an integer? 3 digits to the right, because there are 3 digits after the decimal. So all you have to do is move the decimal to the right 3 times and divide by multiple of 10. And this time, because you're moving it 3 times, you're dividing by 1,000. So your answer is negative 148/1,000. So now why we can't write irrational numbers as a fraction? Here's an example, 8.4673829. This is an irrational number because it never repeats nor terminates. So this decimal form is an irrational number. Now ask yourself the question, how many times do I need to move the decimal to the right to get an integer? I don't know, because this number keeps going on to infinity. It doesn't stop, which means you cannot write it as a fraction because I don't know what to divide it by with multiples of tens, so you can't write it as a fraction. But we said that rational numbers can be written as a fraction. So here's an example, 0.3 repeated. This is a rational number because the decimal form repeats. So how can you write repeated decimal as a fraction? Now let's practice writing this repeated decimal as a fraction. 0.3 repeated. This is a rational number because it repeats. 0.33333 forever. Step number 1 is to write an equation that says x equal that repeated number. So x equals 0.3. That is your first equation, but make sure you have the dash on top of the 3 because that digit 3 is repeated. Now, I need to move the decimal, but I don't know how many times I need to move the decimal. That's why you ask yourself this time, how many digits are repeated? Only 3 is repeated, so 1 digit is repeated, which is the 3. So multiply each side of the equation by multiples of 10, depending on the number of repeated digits. So look at this example. How many digits are repeated? Only the 3. So you have only 1 digit repeated. Therefore, you multiply both sides by 10. Now 10 times x is 10x. And 0.3 repeated times 10, watch what happens. Since you're multiplying by 10, you move the decimal to the right only once. You end up with 3.33333. Another way to write this is 3.3 repeated. So you end up with 10x equals 3.3 repeated. Now, The third step is to subtract the first equation from the new one. You end up with 10x minus x equal 9x, and 3.3 repeated minus 0.3 repeated. Now watch how no matter what the 3 repeated is, you subtracting it from both of them, you end up with just 3. Now step number 4 is to solve for x by dividing both sides by 9. So divide by 9, divide by 9 gives you x equal 3 over 9. So because x is the repeated number, so 0.3 repeated equals 3 over 9. And that's how you write repeated decimal as a fraction. Let's review what we already know. To write 0.3 as a fraction, 3/10, which means 3 over 10. But to write 0.3 repeated as a fraction, you end up with 3/9 because you had to subtract that 1x and then divide by 9. Write 0.6 as a fraction. What would you end up with? 6/10 because it's in the 10th place. But what if you're writing 0.6 repeated as a fraction? You end up with 6/9 because you have to subtract that 1 from the 10 and then divide by 9. Here's another example. 1.26 repeated, but this time the two numbers 26 are repeated. How do you write that as a fraction? Same steps. Step number 1 is to write your first equation, making the x equal that repeated number. Now ask yourself, what is the number of repeated digits? 2 digits are repeated, which is the 26. So step number 2 now is to multiply both sides of the equation by 100 because you're moving the decimal twice this time. So multiply this side by 100, multiply this side by 100. 100 times x is 100x, and 1.26 repeated times 100. That means you're moving the decimal to the right twice. So you end up with 126.26262626. And you can write that as 126.26 repeated. So bring that down, 126.26 repeated. Step number 3 is to subtract the first equation from the new equation that we found. X equal 1.26 repeated, but make sure they lined up. So when you subtract right. 100x minus an x equal 99x. Now 126.26 repeated minus 1.26 repeated. The 26 repeated minus the 26 repeated, those are gone. But 126 minus 1 is 125. So you end up with 99x equal 125. Now isolate x by dividing both sides by 99 this time. 99 divided by 99 gives you x, and 125 divided by 99. Since x is the repeated decimal, therefore the 0.26 repeated equal to the fraction of 125 over 99. You can simplify that and get you 1 and 26 over 90. Here's the last example for today's lesson. 2.08 repeated. Now watch, only the 8 is repeated. So pay attention to the repeated numbers. Step number 1 is to write your equation that says x equal that repeated number. Now ask yourself, how many digits are repeated? Only the 8 is repeated, so only 1 digit. Therefore, step number 2 is to multiply both sides by 10 only, because there's only 1 digit repeated. Multiply this side by 10, multiply this side by 10, you end up with 10x equal, move the decimal to the right once, watch how it's going to be 20.888888, but then you can write it, instead of writing those repeated 8, as 20.8, and then another 8 repeated. So now, step number 3 is to subtract the first equation from this new equation. Bring it x equal 2.08. Make sure they are lined up. So the 8 repeated right under the 8 repeated. When you subtract those equations, 10x minus x is 9x, and 20.888 repeated minus 2.08. Watch how the 8 repeated and the 8 repeated gives you 0, but 8 minus 0 is 8. Bring the decimal down, and 20 minus 2 is 18. So you end up with 18.80. Now, step number 4 is to isolate the x. So divide both sides by 9. You end up with x equal 18.8 divided by 9. Since x is the repeated decimal, so 2.8 repeated equal 18.8 over 9. If I want to simplify that even more, move the decimal to the right 1 and multiply by tens. So you get 188 over 90. Simplify that even more, you get 2 and 89 over 90. So in conclusion, remember that repeated decimal can be written as a fraction. Those are the examples that we went over and the steps that we took to change the decimal into a fraction. Just remember how many digits are repeated for you to know which multiple of 10 to multiply by. That's it for today's lesson. Thank you for liking my videos. If you have any comments, please write it in the comment below and I will answer this as soon as I can. Thank you and see you next time.